I'd like to hear what you thought of how our session went on how do we enable Indigenous leadership, and where are the spaces that we can share collectively together. So who wants to start?
Certainly it was an honour to be asked to be presenting today, and I think the questions should really be posed to the attendees and how they thought it went. But I'm really interested in that one exercise we did today was to get people to write down a question that they had, and some of the questions that were coming in showed a lot of insight from what I saw, but it would be nice to sit down with the two of you and go through them and maybe think about how we could present that back.
So what was the first standout question for you though?
Well, I got the first one that came to me was how do you incorporate Indigenous thinking and Indigenous systems into Western systems? I thought it was a beautiful question because certainly, a lot of focus is on that.
I thought the whole session was very beautiful, and I was surprised, I guess, by the number of people who showed up too. That was really encouraging.
Yes.
I was debriefing with some people who were watching the session and thinking about pharmacy school and how I had classmates laughing at certain things related to Indigenous peoples, right? And to go from that to a session at a global pharmacy conference that's so well attended was just a wonderful reminder, really reassuring.
So obviously Leanne and I have been around the space for a little bit longer than you have, Jaris, and you made the point of, part of this opportunity was to bring together an international perspective of First Nations experiences. So how do you think, what is the future for the next generation that will be talking about how we embed Indigenous leadership not only into curriculum, but into accreditation, into registration, into those processes?
I'll use the word beautiful again. I think the future looks beautiful and bright. I'm so happy that in Canada, anyway, we now have the Indigenous Pharmacy Professionals of Canada. So a community that is active, that works together. For people who aren't yet in the pharmacy profession, they'll be made aware of it. Whereas I was searching for years for that community, right, of people. And now that we have that collective, not only is it wonderful for the Indigenous pharmacy professionals themselves, but we now have this entity for any other stakeholder group, people in Canada, around the world to connect with, to ask questions of, to collaborate with, where it felt quite individual before. I felt quite called on as a singular person, and that did not really make sense with an Indigenous lens, right? I was having to make decisions and give answers from a single person, but now we have a collective of people, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, from across the country of Canada, and a really bright future ahead. And now that there's similar entities too and elsewhere around the world, my goodness, how exciting.
So we have Lippy here, which is the leaders in Indigenous Professional Pharmacy Education, and we learnt so much from the Maori Pharmacist Association that, Leanne, you were such an integral part of formation. What has been those learnings that you've shared with us here in Australia from Aotearoa that now we have the opportunity to collectively start to think about how can we share these?
I like how euphemistically you said little. We have a little extra time on Jaris in terms of where we've been in this space, and the Māori Pharmacist Association we set up 20 years ago now, and I was calling and writing to the Canadians for a great deal of that time too, Jaris, saying come on, and to multiple other countries. So it really is, we do have to reflect. It's great that what you were saying, Jaris, around, well, we've actually had some momentum, because it is important for the likes of Faye and I, who have been in the game a little longer, to reflect on that there is some momentum, but that is absolutely imperative that the students, the graduates that leave universities, that they come out and they know that they're interacting with our mob, our tribes, our iwi, our communities, our people on a daily basis, and how that translates in terms of health outcomes. That's imperative, and it's not just beautiful and rich, it's also required. You know, there is a social justice element to this that is well overdue.
I think one of the things that, whilst we didn't get to touch on it a lot today during the session at FIP, was the important role of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and particularly the right to health. How do we use that as a lever to ensure that when we talk about the right to health as a human right, how do we get the different levers, as I said, education, accreditation, registration, to understand that it's a legal responsibility as well as it's something that, as a society, it's part of that social justice framework. So what's your thoughts on how we use the UNDRIP to frame cultural safety?
It's certainly an important part, and it's one mechanism. You know, we've used multiple, and I think that's it. There's never a single answer or a single approach, but it's part of that. You know, in Aotearoa we have Te Tiriti, so a treaty, and there's multiple treaties in various other countries, so it's certainly part of that. But you do want to bring people along with their hearts as well as their minds, and it's really important to remind them of pieces of legislation, of, you know, collective bodies, etc. But, you know, that it's got to be in parallel, I believe, not, you know, just one.
Yeah.
I think that UNDRIP is a really great way for us to collaborate and find a common ground internationally too. I will be honest though, in Canada, where we have in various places and spaces and certain levels of government said that we've adopted and recognized UNDRIP, but that's not the case. And so I don't know how much we can lean on that in pharmacy to be a driver, or at least not the main driver of us moving forward, because even our highest levels of government in the country might say one thing, but the practice is quite the opposite. So any educators, pharmacists, folks in the system who are working on this work, there's nothing that is modeled for us because UNDRIP hasn't been fully realized, at least in Canada, but I think that we can use that together.
And how do you think, Bloss, in terms of, you know, your role in the universities, about keeping that accountability at the forefront and making Indigenous responsiveness a priority? You know, allocation of resource, allocation of space, allocation of human resource.
And I think that's, you know, such a poignant point. The human resource, the greatest asset we have are the human beings that see the value and then use their positions to ensure that the values become enacted. And that's where we talk about things such as allyship and good leadership. What does good leadership look like? And it's when they take those moments to recognise that it's not a simple tick of box exercise that we get, you know, an Aboriginal academic, or we have a Maori pharmacist or a Canadian pharmacist that is Indigenous, and that it's part of good civil, you know, responsibility for people to be able to see in their institutions people that look, sound and understand their experiences. But it's also part of a system that really acknowledges the role that universities and education institutions have in the positioning of how First Nations people have experienced education and then the opportunity to participate in professions. I think they're the parts that we really need to hold on to, which are the good people, the ones that are doing the work, that are taking, you know, that responsibility. And just whilst I have that moment, I do want to acknowledge Bronwyn Clark through her work through the Australian Pharmacy Council and previously with Aotearoa and the New Zealand Pharmacy Council. But when we find people that recognise A, their privilege, and then B, use their privilege to respond to their responsibility and do it authentically and with deep meaning, then what we see is the opportunity where the spaces are made available. They're not just opened and then shut very quickly. They're made, and so it's not only being invited to the dinner table and then being fed scraps, it's being invited to the dinner table and offered the opportunity to say, what's on the menu, where will it be sourced from, how do we honour that process of, you know, sharing in that, putting together something that we can all gain sustenance and flourish through. And so I think for me that's where universities have a real role, is creating those spaces. But in creating those, they also have to be culturally safe. So we talk about culturally safe practices as pharmacists, but we also need that in our educational institutions so that we attract First Nations students, because there are First Nations peoples in those institutions.
Would you say that what Jaris spoke to before, I call cultural taxation, where he's expected to be the repository of all First Nations knowledge and that he should be the person to go to, would you say that's a contrast to what you're describing in terms of more of a collective response and ensuring that there's more than that resource?
Yeah, I think that is. It's still not always the case, because we know that, you know, still the education systems aren't always culturally safe places. But there are, you know, moments where we can recognise that they are doing that. They are trying to ensure that whilst they offer, they also accept when no is given, rather than, oh, well, shouldn't you want to do that? You know, aren't you the person that should be driving that? And it's like, no, it's a shared responsibility. You have to take your part in this responsibility. And in part of that, it means I get the opportunity to say no to being on everything or being asked to be on everything. And I think you would have experienced similar things too, though.
Well, as I say, I call it cultural taxation, where the expectation is that I'm going to deliver the answer on all of the above. I do wonder if this is a poignant time to bring Bronwyn Clark into our conversation, given that we're sitting here today largely because of her. Faye, before you were talking about creating spaces in universities, and I just wondered if we could talk to Bronwyn a little bit about her career and how she's enabled that space and made sure it is a place that's culturally safe and with outcomes. So I just wondered, Bronwyn, if you wanted to talk to us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Leanne. I think I feel a little bit of a fraud sitting amongst all these wonderful leaders. But I think the key thing for me is that I've been given opportunities to create space for people, and I've really recognised my own privileges that I've had that opportunity. Several years ago, before I met Leanne, we had an opportunity to try and find some Māori pharmacists in New Zealand. And we didn't quite know how to do that. I was working with the Pharmaceutical Society of New Zealand, and we did everything wrong. We went and looked at the list of people registered with us and looked for Māori names. I had a couple of friends who were Māori, and we said to them, would you like to come to a meeting? And fortunately, one of them said yes, and the other one that we found was this wonderful woman here. So really, for me, it's been a fantastic, one of the most satisfying things of my pharmacy career, to be able to encourage our Indigenous colleagues, who are the ones who we need to learn from, and to give them space and initially funding, putting together things, and then coming to Australia, which was about 10 years ago, to be able to bring the expertise and the absolute love from my Māori colleagues to Australia. And then I had the privilege of meeting Faye, and Lippy has grown. So for me, it's about being an ally. It's about being able to create things like we've had with our FIP session, and but it's not about me saying how it's done, and so that's why I feel somewhat awkward sitting here.
I think the other part, though, is particularly for others, is to recognise that non-Indigenous people need to play their roles. They need to understand what they bring to the table and how much they can add to. When I spoke about planning a menu and putting together food, what they bring and what they can then use to bring, and which I think you so eloquently and humbly put, that you've recognised your role and responsibility and how you can use that to enable others. And the challenge, I suppose, for others is how do they get to where you are, which is recognising that they may not be a CEO of an organisation, but they do hold positions that do enable them to do things that allow that opportunity to be created. And I think we've all collectively spoken during the session about where there was good leadership from organisations and individuals that created different parts of looking at how do we create culturally safe workplaces, how do we create culturally safe educational opportunities, how do we share that with the future generation. But the challenge is, what about the generation that's already had their education? What about the generation that are already practicing in pharmacy now across the multiple places that pharmacists work? How do we capture that when not everybody thinks of the engagement and the shared knowledge systems that exist, and that they can exist together when they're paid the due respect? So creating those understandings that we're actually not asking non-Indigenous people to give up their knowledge system, we're just asking them to recognise that ours can sit alongside of them, and that it's not a threat to theirs, but nor should we be seeking to say that we want everything to change all at once. You know, I've heard so many times, even today, that we didn't get to this position in such a short period of time, that the change we want is going to take a little time because there will be different people taking that journey. So the question is how?
I think for me, it's about listening and learning, which I'm quite good at talking. Listening is something I work hard at, and learning. And once again, I have to recognise you two, because Leanne has really given me, to start with, some really, really good feedback when I've got it wrong. And I've got it wrong a lot. And every time I do something that hasn't thought about it from the fact that it's not my job to tell people what to do, it's my job to listen and create space, Leanne's been great at reminding me, and so beautiful at reminding me that I've come to the point now where I don't want to put myself into the position of leading any of this, because I'm not. So I think it's the listening and learning from what you do wrong. And I think many of my colleagues in pharmacy are a little bit scared of doing it wrong. So therefore it's easier not to do anything. And I think Jaris has really given us some lovely examples in our session today of that. But if you're prepared to learn and to listen, then the rewards for everyone are so fabulous. And I really have to admire and respect and pay my real privileged tribute to Arthur Bald, who was the co-founder with Leanne of the Māori Pharmacists. And his family embraced me as my first Māori friend. He was the first friend I had at pharmacy school, and I just felt like part of his family. So I learnt his family weren't dissimilar from mine. They just were different, from a different culture, but it was about supporting and learning and loving each other. And by stopping and actually listening and learning, and occasionally getting it wrong and being humble enough to say, I actually don't know, or I've stuffed up, hopefully that lets other people see that if I can do it, as a little Kiwi white girl, they can do it too.
What you've presented, Bronze, is a wonderful reflection of cultural safety in its totality. You know, that critical reflection of yourself, the acknowledgement of the privilege you held and continue to hold, and how the values of an Indigenous thinking can bring, and then enabling that to make change, you know, transformational change, and creating spaces for that to occur. And that's really about that systemic view as well. So, you know, it's a wonderful case study, I believe, that helps you see the whole picture. And, you know, certainly great thanks to you. I don't know if you've got something else to add in there too, Jaris.
I mean, everybody here is new to me in person, and it's beautiful again to see this history that has taken place here. And in some ways, I almost feel jealous, although that's the wrong word, with a negative tone to it. But I wish I had that, you know, and I think that now I do. And there are folks in the Canadian Pharmacists Association, so similar to the situation here, who came to me and they said, Jaris, we have this money given to us from XYZ, and that money is supposed to go to Indigenous initiatives. What should we do? Because that shouldn't be me deciding that. Like, what do you want to do? And the first thing I said was, well, there's a lot of things that we can do, but we need a community. You know, we need to come together. And so that generosity and kindness and the listening and learning and making space that the folks at the Canadian Pharmacists Association did is what helped birth the Indigenous Pharmacy Professionals of Canada. So it's really neat to see these similarities and how we became something because of folks who made that space for us. Like, I think that we've always identified wanting that community, but we haven't typically existed in those places and spaces of power and privilege. Don't get me wrong, I have a lot of power and privilege myself, but you're a minority, right? And so folks in those places and spaces needed to create that for us. It's beautiful.
And I think what I heard today during the session, though, was the strength of what our culture brings to the work that we do, rather than for a long time, culture was seen as a deficit to our health, and that, you know, we became unhealthy because we were from a particular culture, whereas we're really starting to see the strength of what culture and cultural knowledge does, cultural obligations and responsibilities around changing the narrative, around ensuring that when those places are made available, that we step into them with confidence, and that we step into them knowing that there is work we need to do, but that we don't have to do it by ourselves anymore. That there are people around us that have a shared history or a similar experience that we can draw on, and so that we don't sit in isolation, and that we can potentially come forward as a collective and talk more at an international level of how do we elevate what's happening in each of our communities and our countries to ensure that there are learnings that we can continue to share, not just amongst our 3 countries, but more broadly. And, you know, so
Probably a great place to wrap it up and say join the Living Network.
exactly, join the Living Network. Yes.